A heroin addict attempts to kick his drug habit, but his so-called friends don't help. Special guest Jonathan Weissler joins us to discuss starting a new life in Argentina, slow-mo in a graveyard commercial, and reading Porno on the beach. Choose life as we find out if Trainspotting stands the test of time.
Test of time, James and Alan have their say. Do the movies you love still hold up today? James says gladiator with a glut. Alan says as a father, blah blah. It's the test of time, James and Alan have their say. Do the movies you love still hold up today? Test of time, James and Alan have their say. Do the movies you love still hold up today?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Test of Time. My name is Alan Noah, and joining me, as always, is my friend James Brief. How you doing, James?
I'm good, Al. This is going to be a good episode today.
Yes, it is. Today we are going to be talking about Trainspotting, and to help us is special guest Jonathan Weissler. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. So I think you might be the first guest that we've had on the podcast who came as a special recommendation from a previous guest, our friend Eddie Perez Cortez, who's been on the show a couple times. He's your cousin, and he had told me, hey, you've got to have my cousin Jonathan on the show. Thank you, Eddie, for the recommendation.
Thank you, Eddie.
And you were game to come on, so I'm just going to call it now. This episode's going to be great. It's going to be wonderful, and we all owe Eddie a beer, I guess.
Rightly so.
No heroin, though.
No heroin.
And Jonathan, you also work in the industry. You are a producer.
I am, yeah. I'm based in London, and I have a production company in London, Balagan Productions. We're pretty well known. We've done 24 movies. I do a lot of commercials. Since becoming a dad, I've made a choice to be really careful about where I spend my time. I've not yet learned how to make a movie and have a life. So I do a lot of commercials, and I'm guilty of a lot of crimes against advertising.
What would you consider a crime against advertising?
So I'm quite lucky. I've done some very high-end commercials. I've done commercials for cars. I've done mobile phone companies. I've worked with movie stars, famous models, some of the best directors in the business. I'm also guilty of, in England, and it's probably the same in America, when you get egg fried rice in a Chinese takeaway.
Sure.
A lot of the time, the egg substance comes out of a carton. It's not actually a fresh egg.
Oh.
I once made a commercial for the carton.
Really?
Nice.
Yeah, and that was a bizarre day out. The most bizarre day of all, though, was I'm probably the only producer that I know of in the world who's ever produced a commercial for a graveyard.
Huh.
And it was an absolutely insane experience. I got a call from a director I was working with a lot and said, do you fancy doing a graveyard commercial? And I said, sure. Are you serious? And they go, yeah. And I said, okay. And we needed a field. And I was living at that point about 5 minutes walk away from a large field. And I said, perfect, we're going to film in this field. This is about the maximum amount of effort that needs to go into this. And I got the call back saying, actually, no, the client, want to film in their actual real graveyard, which was in the north of England. And I was absolutely gobsmacked by that. It was completely unnecessary. But the saving grace was we were going to have one of the world's leading Tai Chi experts come in and do all this amazing Kung Fu. And we were going to shoot on 150 frames, ultra slow motion on beautiful 35mm. And it was going to be this stunning sort of Matrix sort of wire work Kung Fu style. And it was going to make the whole experience quite worthwhile. So we ended up chartering, in England we call them coaches, in America you call them buses, to transport 50, 60 people to the north of England. All the cameras and the lights and the cranes all traveled up in other trucks. Being a British film crew, everyone decided to drink their body weight in alcohol and Jack Daniels on the journey up. We get to the hotel and we immediately, being a British film crew, we hit the bar.
Okay.
And I know I left the bar at 3 a.m.
Oh, no.
I'm also fully aware that I was not remotely the last to leave. 4 hours later, I'm now on a film set in an empty graveyard, a large field. And I'm nursing what can only be called a significant hangover. And I know I'm not the worst out of the groups with me. I know some of these people have barely slept. And I'm standing with the cinematographer, JP Gossart, who's just finished shooting the Lord of the Rings TV show, Rings of Power.
Okay.
And the director, we're standing there and we wheel in this serious Tai Chi guy to show us his Kung Fu. And at which point we say, great, we've never met him before. So what can you do? And he then proceeds to do this.
Just for our listeners, you were doing a very slow movement with your hands.
And I realized we've made a fuck up. It wasn't some exotic martial art. It was Tai Chi, which is one of the slowest forms of motion you can get.
Right.
And I realized we've now got to make this interesting for 30 seconds. And me, the director and the cinematographer just looked at each other without a clue in the world on how to make this work. But we did, and it looked good. And that's just one example of a silly commercial.
So in the end, what did you do? How did you make it interesting? How did you film this commercial?
We shot it badly. We were going to do time lapse and we were going to speed up the photography and post-production. And we found a way to kind of muddle through this. And it was going to look beautiful. Then the next hard part was around 11 a.m. and my phone rings. It was a lawyer phoning me, telling me that I'd been shortlisted to run Channel 4's drama department.
Oh.
As head of physical production. And I naturally assume it's one of my crew pranking me. Anyway, so I was a little bit curt with my words to this alleged lawyer, looking around for which of my crew was on a mobile phone laughing. Anyway, 2 hours later, I got another phone call and an email, and it was a real offer.
Oh, wow.
So it was a very memorable day. But listen, I've done 500 commercials, and they're lots of fun. They're a great way to stay on top of your craft. So when The Matrix came out and everyone was doing something called flow-mo photography, where you kind of created still cameras around an object and then they all went off in unison to create the illusion of movement around a static object that was actually in motion. Before The Matrix came out, we knew it was in the trailer and we shot it for a commercial. So for about 2 weeks, I was the most cutting edge visual effects heavy shoot on the planet. And then The Matrix comes out and then 1,000 other shoots do exactly the same gag. So you can have a lot of fun. But I enjoy commercials. I work a lot with a chap called Tony Kaye, if you know him.
No.
Famous for a movie called American History X.
Oh, yes, of course. Sure.
Yeah, so we do stuff. I do Wowie mobile phones with Gal Gadot, who plays Wonder Woman.
Sure.
Movie-wise, I've done a lot of movies. And at the same time, now I've got kids. I'm really fussy about how I spend my time. Equally, now my kids are 9 and 6. I'm going back to the dark side. I spoke with my partner. She understands that I have to shoot something that lasts more than 30 seconds. I don't want my epitaph to be, "Dear lies Jonathan Weissler, Amoy Noodles stock went up 12% the week of his commercial." I've got a movie with a large streamer that they've approached me to produce. And I've got another movie with a very well-known director in the UK that we're about to announce. And it's exciting times. It's a very interesting time to be working in the film industry. There's a lot of transitions, there's a lot of changes, and I think it's a little bit like Darwinism at the moment. You know, it's survival of the fittest, and not everyone will make it at the moment. We're living in this sort of post-streaming world where a lot of things have been shot, and the streamers and studios realize that the public only have one set of eyes and maybe a couple of hours a day to watch content.
Yeah.
So we have to be far more specific about what we shoot. And after the first lockdown in England in 2020, sort of summer 2020, we exploded with filmmaking. It'd never been so busy in this country.
Oh, wow.
And as a consequence, you couldn't get cameras, you couldn't get crew. A lot of people stepped up. A lot of junior people became mid-level people became high people. Unfortunately, they didn't have the experience, didn't have the production savviness, and a lot of mistakes were made. A lot of budgets were hemorrhaging.
Okay.
And at the same time, the streamers have all now announced themselves. There are no more launches of new channels who need new content. So the industry is retracting a little bit, which happens. And I think there's a grown-up side of a conversation where not everyone will make it. And at the same time, there will always be a need for what we do and to tell stories. I think we're in a world where the good stories and the good filmmakers making movies at the right budgets will prevail.
Sure. It's funny you say that. I mean, it's cyclical, right? And there's always ebbs and flows and peaks and valleys. And yes, certainly streaming disrupted everything. Definitely COVID had a huge impact. Where do you think the movie industry is heading towards, even if it's just in the UK or worldwide? What's your prediction for the next few years?
Okay, so it's interesting because in England, we're probably the number one place on earth to make films and make high-end television. But at the same time, 90-something% of what we do is for American streamers or American studios. It's for Disney, it's for Warner Brothers, it's for Universal, it's for Netflix.
Interesting.
And as a consequence, it's not a British film industry. We're a concierge service. So for me, my friends who are all working on Marvel movies and Star Wars and this and that, and we're no different than concierge. The profits don't stay in the country, and we're not nurturing as many homegrown filmmakers. And I think it's a global issue, not just an English issue, where, we're very much in the content business. And the flip side is we have to know this because we're a business. We're not here to lose money or make an artistic whim. We're here to, whatever we spend, we need to make back with a percentage.
Sure.
And you have to balance the two, which is the true art of filmmaking. I remember George Clooney once saying, you make one for the studio and one for the art. Apparently, like when he said yes to Ocean's 11, it was under the stipulation you got to fund one of his other indie films. And I think, I think Spielberg said yes to. He wanted to get funding for Schindler's List, so he told Universal, "Yeah, I'll make your dinosaur movie, but you got to fund this passion film."
Oh God, yeah. Sidney Lumet, who's an amazing director. I hope you've covered a bit of his work. He famously said, "Every hit buys me 3 flops."
Right.
And Clint Eastwood famously said, I do one for me, one for the studio.
Right.
And you have to balance it. My most successful film, I produced a movie in 2001 called The Brasserie, and we were the 5th highest grossing film in Asia of 2001.
Wow.
We did $38 million in cinemas, and this is without a Chinese market. And we did it off a $5 million budget. So we were great. And I pray you never watch it. It's about 2 men who open up a bra factory. It's dreadful. And the only reason I said yes to it was because I got to go to Hong Kong for 6 months.
That sounds fun.
Nobody knows anything. That's a great quote. If you know who said that.
No.
Guy called William Goldman.
Oh, okay.
I've turned down some phenomenal movies, and I've said yes to some absolute garbage. And another great adage, there's a guy called Frank Price, and he ran Columbia Studios in the 80s. And when he left, he said, if I said yes to everything I said no to, and I said no to everything I said yes to, he said it'd have been about the same, apart from E.T. He said turning that down was a mistake. So we've all got those stories.
I have to say, as somebody who's not in the film industry, advertisements are sometimes some of the greatest short films I've ever seen, especially some stuff I've seen out of Europe. Sometimes you see these things, we find them online.
It's interesting you say that, because with commercials, there's 2 different markets. There's conceptual markets, which you get in Western Europe, you'll get it in France, you'll get it in Scandinavia, you'll get it in England, you'll get it in Spain. You can do a story which is completely conceptual. And then there is also, let's get someone famous or get someone pretty. And at the end of it, the moral of the message is, if you buy this product, you can be like me, or you can sleep with me.
Right.
It's like car commercials. There's 2 types of car commercial in the world. If the car is an average man's car, you'll notice they always leave a regular house with a regular family with children, and they're going to an airport or they're doing something, and they often get peace or sanctuary in the car. But then with the high-end cars, they're always driving home.
Wow.
And their home is always a postmodern architectural piece of art. And they live in tranquil landscape gardens, mountainous valleys, and you've seen 100 of these things. There's a subliminal message that all of these commercials have. So when I did a lot of commercials for Huawei, which I'm not sure we're allowed to say their name anymore, big Chinese mobile phone company, we had Gal Gadot, and the commercials I was doing were all for Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and Asia. And as a consequence, it was Gal Gadot who looked like an absolute goddess in interesting environments. And the idea at the end was, have a phone because you're worth it. At the same time, Huawei did a commercial for a more sophisticated audience, England, America, France, Scandinavia, and it had Scarlett Johansson and Henry Cavill. And they were really witty, clever, conceptual commercials. And the Gal Gadot one, you could have hired any glamorous sort of supermodel and it would have been exactly the same. But people know their markets. They're not doing this by accident. They're not even dumbing down. They just know what sells. And it's the same principles that go into movie making. You've got to make a movie that makes its money back.
Right.
Rule number 1, make a film that can actually be seen by an audience.
This is true. Well, let's talk about Trainspotting, which is a movie that did make its money back and then some. James, why don't you tell our listeners what Trainspotting is all about in case they haven't seen the movie?
Sure. Trainspotting follows a group of friends in Edinburgh, Scotland, who are struggling with heroin addiction. The story is centered on Mark Renton, who begins the movie trying to quit drugs. Of course, it's easier said than done, and Renton doesn't get much support from his friends either. There's Spud, a kind-hearted but hapless addict. Sick Boy, he's obsessed with Sean Connery, and he's also extremely manipulative. Begbie, he's violent and unpredictable. Tommy refuses to touch heroin until he suffers a painful breakup, which is caused in part by Renton. Tommy quickly becomes an addict. Renton and his friends are on a downward spiral as they steal, overdose, and even cause the death of an infant. Renton is able to get clean by moving to London, but when Begbie and Sick Boy show up at his flat unannounced, Renton is once again lured into their world. Sick Boy asks Renton for help with a drug deal, which goes off surprisingly well, but after watching Begbie brutally beat an innocent man, Renton decides to steal the drug money and abandon his friends.
Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to sum up a movie like this because the plot is
secondary.
Yeah, exactly. And I normally would say, how did this movie do? Did it make money? I know that Trainspotting made money. I don't know that it was a huge gargantuan blockbuster, but its budget was so low and it was enough of a hit that it definitely made its money back. Isn't that right, James?
Oh, yeah, this movie was a huge hit. I've seen different records anywhere from 1.5 to 3.5 million pounds for its budget.
1.8.
1.8, so right in there. It opened on July 19th, 1996. It had a small rollout in the States eventually. The most it ever got was 375 screens, and only 3 times did it make over $1 million in a weekend. However, it made $16 million domestically in the United States, 12 million pounds in the UK, and $72 million internationally. So, huge hit.
So, Jonathan, when the movie came out, did you see it in the theater?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for us, the film came out in January 96.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't talk about Trainspotting without talking about a film called Shallow Grave.
Right.
And Shallow Grave was Danny Boyle's first movie. And it wasn't a huge hit in England. It was significantly successful, but it wasn't top 10 of the year. But it really announced a new filmmaking voice, a director, a producer, and a writer who had their actor, they had their Ewan McGregor, and they were telling really interesting and fresh stories. Trainspotting was a novel by Irvine Welsh. It's a novel without a real plot, and so's the movie. It's a lost generation. It's a group of deprived young people in a poor part of Scotland, and the film is ridiculously charming. It's ridiculously entertaining. It's very, very funny. And within that is that tragicness and the bleakness of, their lives are effed. You know that these people aren't going to escape it. And I think it's worth talking of on the business side. Yeah, the film was a monumentally huge film. In England, you couldn't go anywhere. It was zeitgeist. It became a cultural phenomenon. The poster, which on the DVD sleeve is electric. There were T-shirts of it. The movie had a soundtrack which was off the charts. A lot of Iggy Pop and Lou Reed and new bands at the time, bands like Pulp and Blur. It was capturing a bit of Britpop. So it really was zeitgeist. What's interesting, and you guys don't know this about Kevin McKidd, when the film finished, Kevin went on holiday. And because of that, he missed the photo session for the poster.
Right.
Which is why he's not on the poster. And he says it was the most expensive holiday of his life because he missed out on so much audience awareness of his character. And his character is actually probably the most tragic.
Oh, yeah.
What's the name of Kevin's character?
Tommy.
Tommy was normal. He was the most normal one of them all. He had a girlfriend. He had a job. He didn't do drugs. He didn't drink. He was a regular guy whose life was going to be fine until Mark Renton does something quite innocently, and the kind of thing any young guy would do, where he accidentally takes the tape of the homemade porn movie of this character and his girlfriend, watches it, and at which point they realize the tape's lost and it ends his relationship, and then he sinks very fast into drug addiction. Remember, the movie is set 10 years, it's set in the 80s, the film. It's not set in the 90s. He dies of AIDS.
Right. And it's interesting because Renton never apologizes. He never comes clean. He never offers to give the tape back.
The damage was done. It's the kind of thing that any young guy could do for a joke with his friends, steal his friend's homemade porn, not realizing the huge collateral damage it happens when the couple find out it's gone missing. And then this character says, I might have returned it to the video store.
Right.
And the girlfriend says, what, half of Edinburgh is watching us bonk. And his relationship died at that point.
Sure.
I think, if anything, Renton's character is a precursor to the narrator in Fight Club. He represents the same generation. And I don't believe
Yeah.
you'd have had Fight Club without Trainspotting,
Sure.
where it was talking to a lost generation. That's why it was choose life, choose a job, choose a big television. And he goes, I chose not to because he found something more interesting. And Fight
Right.
Club is set in a world where you have all these offers in front of you, but hey, none of them are making us real. I think Renton was such a his voice resonated so deeply with young people.
I definitely think you're right. I mean, you could also even maybe put Pulp Fiction, Reservoir Dogs in that category where, by all accounts at the time, and certainly with the benefit of hindsight, the 1990s were great. Everything was going great. You know, there were no huge wars, terrorism hadn't become a threat, there was no pandemics, politics was relatively tame, but that kind of led to this sort of counterculture movement, which you saw in some of these movies like Trainspotting, the Tarantino movies, Fight Club, certainly, which is like kind of pushing back.
I mean, Reservoir Dogs was probably the most influential film I had when I got into the movie industry professionally. In those days, I was working on big studio films. I was an assistant director on Braveheart. I was visual effects coordinator on the first Mission Impossible. And I was doing big studio films as a small cog. And out of nowhere, Reservoir Dogs came out, and it was made for the cost of a day's filming on some of these big movies.
Sure.
And it was so energetic, it was so fresh, the dialogue was so real, it was so hip. But for me, Tarantino is fantasy. There's no real grounding there. It's always this animated, hyper intense, dramatically, they don't live in the real world. Everyone in Trainspotting, you actually recognize from some shit town somewhere in the world. You've never met anyone from a Quentin Tarantino film because they're fantasy characters. So
Interesting.
excuse the drug analogy, but they tap into a different vein.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the drug use in the movie because that is so much of what Trainspotting is. And as you mentioned, it was a novel that was a huge hit in England. I think it was on a lot of bestseller lists. It was going to be adapted, but the author, Irvine Welsh, didn't want it to be like a finger wagging cautionary tale about the evils of drug use. And when Danny Boyle pitched his vision for it, it was going to be more about the experience and kind of the things you were talking about, the soundtrack and building out this whole world. But I think at the same time, you could still look at this movie and say that even though it's not lecturing to the audience with a finger wag, don't you do drugs, kids, it kind of still is saying that, because who the fuck would want to do heroin after watching these 93 minutes?
Quite a few people.
You think? You think the movie advertised it?
Yeah, because at the end of the movie, even though he chose not to choose life. He chose just to escape. There's no happy ending. It's just he escaped. He didn't escape victorious. He escaped with what, £4,000, which in 96 money, maybe like $10,000 now. That's not going to do anything for you. As we joke, that's not enough to start a new life in Argentina. We were watching the film the other day. I found the drug usage very tame, probably because I've seen other movies that have gone down the drug world in a far more gruesome and perhaps honest way, like Requiem for a Dream, for example.
Exactly. Yeah.
That sort of, this is what happens when an entire family go through addiction in different ways, and the devastation. Yes, there is a baby who is neglected in the movie and haunts our character when he's going through rehab, but it's done in it's so entertaining. It's so fun to watch. I mean, there's even a line in the voiceover. He goes, just imagine the best orgasm you've ever had and then multiply it by 1,000. And then he says, that's why we do it. They're not stupid. They are stupid. I'm not stupid, but
yeah, I think so.
They're doing it for a reason. And in the film industry, I always say we're a broad church. We accept anyone for any of their sins on the one condition that they do their day job. So yeah, heroin isn't something I advocate, or any hard drug, but at the same time, I'm never going to tell anyone what they can or cannot do. And I know functioning filmmakers, like who knew Philip Seymour Hoffman was on heroin right up until the day he died. It was well known within the industry. I know other actors right now who are taking very heavy drugs. I had an actor once pass out in a trailer with a needle in their arm.
Wow.
And that was a fun day out. Yeah.
Jeez.
That's probably a tangent I shouldn't go down, but we fixed it. We carried on with the movie. The hardest thing was making sure no one knew what happened. Shall I divulge? Shall I just tell you that little?
That's up to you.
So I was doing a movie, and an actor who I knew had a reputation for partying was on our shoot. Lovely guy, became friends with the guy during the shoot. And we're having lunch, and the second assistant director just pulls me aside as I'm walking past the trailer and says, "Come in and out." I walk into his trailer, and he's passed out with a syringe in his arm. I'm like, oh fuck. First of all, I thought this guy had died, realized he hadn't. And I'm like, right, what do I do? There's two things. Number one is I've got to make sure this guy doesn't die. But the second thing is I have to finish this movie. And I've got to think very carefully what I do, because this film could die today. He's my lead actor.
Wow.
So I pulled out the needle out of his arm, which is a very strange feeling because it kind of slurps out. It's not a, anyway. And now I'm like, now he's unconscious. I'm giving him a tap on the face. He's not waking up. I'm like, right, he needs to go to a hospital. But if he goes to the hospital, it'll become a news story. And the only person that knows this is the second assistant director and me. So I pull my car right up to his trailer, and then we carry him into the back of my car. And it was like his feet are being dragged. As he gets into my car, I shout at the top of my voice, "I told you not to have the shellfish." So now word is out, this guy's got food poisoning. I drive him to a private doctor who gives him an injection of something. A few minutes later, he's conscious. 10 minutes later, he's kind of come to. And the doctor says, right, this man needs rehab. And I said, yeah, but I can't. I need him to, I've got like a month on this movie. This guy needs to finish my movie. And he goes, well, my advice is rehab. And I said, well, if I gave him rehab in a month, what do I do? He goes, you've got to monitor his drug intake because he's not going to stop. So I had to become his drug dealer.
Oh my God.
He comes on set the next day, and I then have to go and source heroin. And in those days, people I knew who might have been able to provide significantly milder things than heroin, I was phoning them up going, hey, you haven't got any like heroin, have you? And they're like, Jonathan, please don't do it. I'm like, no, it's not for me, which sounds like it really is.
It's for a friend,
Sure.
a friend of mine. They
It's
go
for
to
my
another
friend.
school.
It's my movie friend. You know him, yeah. So I had to buy heroin, and I worked out what I needed to buy. Being the producer in me, I bulk bought, which in hindsight probably shouldn't have done. I got a better price, and I had enough to get through the month. I gave him his drugs every day, and his agent at this point knew. No one on the crew knew. The director didn't know. As far as everyone else was concerned, he had food poisoning. And on the day after we finished filming, he went to rehab. And this man you can watch in movies and TV shows right now, and you'll never know his name.
Wow.
As a filmmaker, the show must go on. You must finish the film. You know, in hindsight, was that a right thing to do? Yeah, it was. Was I going to change his life by starting rehab a month earlier? No, I'd just shut my movie down, become a significant insurance claim, lawyers everywhere, lots of people losing money, millions and millions of pounds at risk, you know, the budget of the movie. So yeah, I made the choice. I stand by it. I did what I had to do, and we got the film done.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
That beats most of the little anecdotes out and I could talk about every day.
Oh yeah, sure. Oh, that does sort of speak to the point about how hard it is to give up drugs. And, you know, Renton early in the movie says, okay, I'm just going to quit. And he has his preparations. He has the cans of soup. He's got his porno that he needs. He barricades himself in and then says, oh, actually, I'm just going to need one more hit to take the edge off. And then you just see all of the wooden planks on the floor next to the door. And really, I think the beginning, I don't know, maybe 45 minutes or so of the movie does kind of take a lighter approach to the drug abuse that comes to a head when the baby dies. And then all of a sudden, this shit isn't funny anymore. This isn't mischief of these ne'er-do-wells who are, you know, shooting the dog with the air rifle. I mean, that's pretty fucked up, but yeah, no one's getting really hurt.
And there was some fascist neo-Nazi skinhead who was with the dog, so no one minded that guy getting mauled. You know, the point is that they got away with a lot of it because they made it so fucking entertaining.
Right.
It wasn't some dour, reality-driven, squalid. It was fantastical. It was fantasy. Our character freeze frames. He jumps into shots. And it was directed with so much swagger. I mean, technically, I thought the film wasn't particularly great. I mean, I don't think it was well lit. It was very cheap. They built their film sets in Scotland. They had an abandoned warehouse. They built all their rooms they shot in. It looked cheap, but the direction, the editing was off the charts. And then put in the soundtrack, and that's what elevated it.
And my
Definitely.
favorite part of the scene with the dead baby is, I mean, you hear this horrible mother and father's wailing. Then someone takes out some heroin, and then the parents are like crying, crying. Wait a second, can I have a little bit of that?
There was a great line though. There was a great moment where Ewan McGregor goes, "Obviously, she came after me," because there's the whole etiquette: who gets to have the first, and who gets to have the second, and the third. And it just showed you that that was everyone's primary force in life. You
Yeah,
know,
exactly.
I think there's a darkness that the film did a very good job of staying away from for the most part. And it's interesting, and I'm going to say something quite perverse now, but I've seen the film probably 20 times. I watched it a lot when it came out. You know, I've seen it over the years many times. I watched it last night. For me, the baby passing was always a minor story beat. And listening to you guys chat, I can see what a phenomenally profound reaction you guys have had to that. What it does is it triggers the more serious side of the plot.
Yeah.
It triggers all of our characters' decline. Tommy ends up going into addiction. Spud, he can't decline anymore. That's his crime. He's just always going to fail.
Right.
You know, and eventually Mark Renton goes into rehab and it fails. And then he escapes and he goes to London. And he's about to become a yuppie. He's about to become a capitalist. He's not just having a job. He's becoming we call them in England estate agents, realtors in America. And that's a pretty low end profession. It's sort of the people that do that are not looked at particularly highly, but he didn't give a shit because he was making money. And then obviously it all kicks off when he gets followed by Begbie and Sick Boy and everyone comes along. But there's also a scene later when they say the music's changing, the drugs, the fucking, everything changes. The music changed. I was an indie boy. I liked my Britpop back in the early 90s. And all of a sudden it became electro, it became dance music. And I felt lost, and I was younger than these characters were. Everything changed in the 90s.
Sure. The soundtrack does feature, it's almost like three eras, right? Like there's kind of more of the classic rock era, you know, Iggy Pop and Bowie, and then sort of the Britpop, you have New Order, you have Blur, you have Pulp, and then it really goes into, you know, the electronica, the dance.
The dance scene.
Right. You know, like when you think about it, like those three very different sounds, they came up in what, 15-ish years?
Completely.
Yeah, like things change really fast. And when Renton is saying in voiceover about how music is changing and the world is changing, and he says gender is changing, I forget the exact quote, but it's like in 100 years there will be no boys or girls, just wankers.
Yeah.
Like in a way that is fairly progressive, you know, for 1996, that he's speaking about gender fluidity. And when Begbie's in the car with the transgender girl, he doesn't react in the way that you think he would by acting violently towards her. It's only, you know, he steps out of the car, he punches the wall, he nearly kills Renton.
But it was such a profound shock for his character. It was so beyond anything he'd ever seen before. And he was a basic guy. He was simple. He was never going to be able to survive in the big world. He was a big man in a small town, not a small man in a big town. And, you know, he was struggling. But the other thing to talk about the music was that it was all juxtaposition. All the music was ironic. Every music cue in the movie was ironic. The lyrics were ironic to the events that they were following on screen.
Even Lust for Life?
Yeah. I mean, what's Lust for Life about?
Heroin.
About junkies.
Yeah.
Yeah. But also it's a positive song, and you've got to make a moral choice whether you saw the film's journey as positive. Most people superficially would have done because it was so much fun to watch. But at the end of the day, these are tragic, broken characters who lives tragic, broken lives. And, you know, the only one who arguably got out of it in any meaningful way is Renton, but ultimately he didn't. You've seen the sequel. His life never became perfect. At best, he had an average life, and he failed that too.
I never saw the sequel, but the way I sort of had the character go after just watching Trainspotting 1 was that, oh yeah, this guy's going to be sober for months, weeks, maybe years.
Maybe a day.
Yeah, it's not going to last long. I didn't watch T2, but I clicked on the Wikipedia synopsis, and I guess apparently he was sober for 20 years or something like that.
He was living a mediocre life.
I find that surprising, just from the way that this movie ends. I mean, the fact that he manages to stay sober.
He kind of does. He's away from temptation. Have you read the book Porno? That's the
I have
sequel.
not.
The movie's T2 is quite different than the book. Trainspotting 1 is all about a lost generation and anger and it's rebellion and it's punk. Trainspotting 2 is about regret. It's about characters in their middle age who haven't achieved what perhaps they should have done, and they're all failures. And there's a scene in Trainspotting 2, and I'm going to say spoiler, where Spud's character tries to commit suicide and he fails at it because his character is going to fail at everything he does. And I found that so poignant. Trainspotting 2 will bring a tear to your eye.
Oh,
Not
yeah.
out of sadness, but out of acceptance that these characters are doomed and they were broken. And there's a scene, can I spoil it?
Sure, go for it.
There's a scene at the very end of Trainspotting 2 where you see them all as children in the playground and you see all their hopes and their dreams all shattered by where they are at the end of the movie. And you see them as children and they had all the optimism in the world, but they were still in like in England, we call them council estates. In America, you'd call them projects.
Okay.
You know, these were people or tenements. They were still poor and deprived and they didn't even know it. There were no jobs for these kids. There were no opportunities. So yeah, petty crime and drugs is like the best thing you can do. And that's a global thing. That's not just a Scottish or a London thing. You got fentanyl in America. How's that working out? You know,
Not great,
cheaper than heroin.
I guess. I feel like we haven't even talked about some of the other like really notable things that happen in the movie, like when Renton has sex with a minor. She is supposed to be 14 years old. In real life, the actress was 19. Kelly MacDonald, who I loved in Boardwalk Empire. I completely forgot that she was in this movie. Like, one thing that I did remember about the movie was when he goes into the toilet, which is a horrifically disgusting scene, but also the way it's shot, the surrealism of it, it's just beautiful as he's swimming in these crystal blue waters of the worst toilet in Scotland.
Avoiding landmines.
Of course, as one does when swimming in a toilet.
So interesting. Would you be able to make Trainspotting today in 2024? And the answer is yeah, you probably could. The underage sex, they set it up very well in the film because he meets her in a nightclub. They have consensual sex. And it's only the next day you realize that you see her in a school uniform.
Right.
And also in 1996, that was not a taboo subject. It was something that we accepted this character did. It wasn't done in any nefarious agenda. It was just a guy who met a girl in a bar and she ended up being underage. I never knew she was 14. I always thought, I just assumed she was at school, which could even mean 16, which is the legal age of consent in England. But in these days, watching it now, I can imagine it being quite a provocative storyline that our lead character is sleeping with a schoolgirl. Because good luck pitching that in a meeting at Netflix.
Right. It does all sort of fit the theme with these characters who are just awful, awful people. I mean, like when Begbie throws the mug from the balcony, and then there's the freeze frame, and then the different versions of the story and everything. That's fairly early in the movie. You see what it does to this woman's face.
But there's no consequence to that.
Exactly. Like these guys just live in a world where they can do shit like that, and whatever. It's just, a Tuesday night or whatever.
Yeah. Begbie's drug was violence. It's really, there's a scene in the second movie where he takes Viagra, Begbie.
Okay.
And it doesn't make him hard. And he's confused. And then he starts a fight and he realizes he's very aroused. And it is hysterical. You are laughing your ass off watching a really powerful, not sickening, but Danny Boyle's very good. And the film, both Trainspotting 1 and 2, are very good at making you laugh at horrible things. And it forces you to make a moral judgment. But I don't see these characters as bad. I just see them as human. I even see Sick Boy. Sick Boy's pretty fucking harmless. I mean, he sets himself up to be some pimp and some drug dealer, and he's obsessed with Sean Connery. But at the end of the day, the script and the performance probably was a few more IQ points above how the character probably should have been.
Okay.
Begbie was the predator. Spud is some guy who just needs help. And then Tommy, I mean, he's the one at the beginning of the movie who thinks okay, and he's the one who suffers the worst in the first movie.
Sure. Well, what about Renton? Do you think that he's a bad person? He says that in voiceover. He says, that's the reason why I do all of these things. I'm just a bad person. I bought that he was, but you disagree, Jonathan?
Is he a bad person? No. Does he do horrible things? Yeah, he steals, he shoplifts. Any drug addict will do what they can to get their fix.
Yeah.
And also, he's so damn likable. Ewan McGregor, I knew him back in the day. We knew each other. You know, he's a great guy. He's charismatic. You know, this was a phenomenal performance. He was ridiculously likable.
Sure.
I always watch a movie and go, which of these characters would I have over to my house for dinner? And probably, yeah, if I had to choose for dinner, I'd probably go for Sick Boy just because he's fun. Renton actually doesn't bring much to the party.
Right.
But it's just his story. Spud is terrible. Begbie will probably burn my house down.
Right.
You know, Tommy doesn't count because he's very much a secondary character. His only function is to fall.
That's true. What do you think, James, about Renton? Is he a bad person? Make a moral judgment.
I don't think there's a way of judging either way. I think the guy's an opioid addict. He's a heroin addict. We don't know the circumstances of how he even became a heroin addict, and that's probably irrelevant. But I think it's like you said. He steals. He shoplifts. But he doesn't do what Begbie does. He doesn't like stab and kill people. I think it's hard to tell that he's a good or bad person. I think he thinks he's a bad person because he's feeling guilty about what he's done several times in the film. In the course of a 90-minute film, he tries to quit several times. He thinks he's a horrible person. I'm not convinced that he is, but I don't think the film tells you either way.
I think that's a good sign of a good film. It asks you to make a choice.
That's fair.
I'm not saying he's a great person. I just think he's human.
I think he's a bad person. I mean, I think the ending where he steals from Begbie and he steals from Sick Boy, you don't care about them. The fact that he steals from Spud, yes, you feel bad about that, but so does he. And then we see that shot where he does put some money in the locker for him so that he's not completely dicking over the one guy who doesn't deserve it.
But that's your cathartic climax of the movie right there. That's the human moment that redeems Renton of any badness because he does the right thing for the weakest character.
To me, that wasn't redemption for the character. For me, that was more of the first thing you said, for catharsis for the audience, because if you don't have that shot, Spud, by the way, is also bleeding out on the floor because Begbie accidentally slashes him. And, you know, he's not getting any medical treatment. He is on the floor covered in blood. This was a deep cut. And Renton, steps over him to get to the door. Even if his plan all along is, I'll mail him some money, you don't even know that this guy's going to live. He's just letting him bleed on the floor. I felt like sending the money was the very, very, very least he could do. And it is very nice for the audience to know not only that Spud isn't fucked over, but also just that he lives, that he survives this and he gets the money and he has a little smile. I feel like that's how you kind of want to send the audience out into the world, is by seeing that and not just Renton monologuing about how he will choose life and the luggage and all of that.
I think that last shot of Spud smiling is great, even though it really, to me, is a smile of oh my God, I have my heroin covered for the next, who knows how long, a week, 2 weeks, or until someone robs him. So it's a little sad because it's not like he's going to turn his life around. Because as you said, it's not enough to make a new life in Argentina.
No.
Jonathan, was there anything else you had from your notes? Anything else you wanted to
Yeah, let me just go through them.
Yeah, please.
I mean, just watching this in London in 96 when it came out, this film was zeitgeist. I was 21 when it came out. It was a phenomenally important cultural experience for the entire country. And it made, what, £12 million? And it was probably watched by 3 or 4 million people, in cinema. Cinema tickets were a lot cheaper. Yeah, I mean, it opened in America. There was a lot of controversy because I can't remember if they tried to redub the voices because the accents were too hard to understand.
Yeah, in the first 20 minutes or something.
Yeah, I mean, there's a moment in the movie where they use subtitles because they're in a nightclub, and it's kind of funny and it was clever because they were talking about completely different things, to what they confess to. What you're talking about, the boys say football. What you girls talking about? Shopping. No, what they're talking about was sex.
Right.
That's the funniest line in the film.
Yeah, and it's great. The film itself, production-wise, it was a huge cultural phenomenon. the soundtrack went to number one. I still own a CD of the soundtrack.
Oh, nice.
It was so important. I think the sequel could have come a lot sooner, but I think there are a lot of reasons behind the scenes why it took so long to get done. Just going through my notes, the book was considered unfilmable. There was an early draft of the script that didn't have any form of ending because it just goes on and on and on. In a good way, you're just immersing yourself in these insane experiences, not adventures, but experiences these characters go through.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's worth saying that Danny Boyle, for me, is a very hit and miss director. When he's given a good script, he can give you Trainspotting. And I think when he gets given a weak script, he'll give you Sunshine. I think sometimes Danny Boyle's focus is very different to the genre of the movie you're watching. Like 28 Days Later is a zombie movie, yet Danny Boyle is more interested in the rage within all of us, and our character becomes as bad as a zombie in the third act. And I found that a really alienating experience, and the same kind of ending happened in Sunshine, which didn't make a lot of sense, but it was fun. It would look good at least. But I think Danny Boyle, I think he's got a lot of integrity as a filmmaker. I don't always love his films, but I think Trainspotting is a masterpiece. Clockwork Orange, that's another film I think this film lives in the shadow of. I think some of the earlier stuff felt very similar to Clockwork Orange in terms of tone, where you've got your anti-heroes. I don't know if you guys seen Clockwork Orange?
Yes.
Yes.
You're following Alex, who's a droog, and they're the bad guys. Yeah, they're the guys you follow and you fall in love with. I think you can't make a film in England without following Clockwork Orange if you're doing it that way, especially how surreal it was. Interesting. I went to some industry screening of Sunshine, the Danny Boyle movie, years ago when it came out, and I was at the National Film Theatre, which is a serious cinema in London, and Danny Boyle came on stage, did a Q&A, and they played 30 seconds of Trainspotting with the music, Lust for Life, and I realized there was more energy in those 30 seconds than the entire movie I just watched.
Oh, wow.
I think it's an important film. Would I show it to my kids? I can't wait for them to be old enough to watch it. Would I show it in schools? Yeah, I think I would. There's a movie by a guy called Larry Clark called Kids. I don't know if you've seen it.
We did that on the podcast, yes. I still carry the scars of that movie.
I haven't seen it in a long time, but I remember going, that should be shown in schools. Kids, this is what's out there, boys and girls. Is this what you want?
I would disagree with that because we just watched that movie maybe a couple years ago. It's a little fresher in my mind. That movie is more glamorizing the drug use and the violence. This movie, I think, really shows you all of the negative consequences that go along with it, which I could say, yeah, show this to kids, and then they're more likely to say, yeah, I wouldn't want to touch any of that stuff. Whereas in kids, it's like, hey, kids, doesn't this look fun?
It's interesting. For me, what Kids was about some girl getting AIDS, getting HIV, and having unprotected sex by a character who is basically specializing in his party trick is impregnating virgins without a condom. So for me, it was a sexual kind of message, not a violent message. I think violence just exists in the world. Any kid puts on a computer game, they're going to deal with more violence than any of these movies.
That's true.
And for me, Trainspotting, I didn't find particularly realistic because I found it such a fantastical story. I think you want to see real, go and watch Requiem for a Dream. Let me go and have a think and email you a list of more serious, more grounded films that go into some of this world. There's a film called Nil by Mouth. Gary Oldman directed it.
Okay.
And taking it back to a conversation, it was financed by Luc Besson's company. And he said, you finance my movie and I'll play the bad guy in Fifth Element.
Oh, wow.
And Nil by Mouth is a film I actually walked out of during the movie because of a scene that is so brutal to watch. I came back in about 10 minutes later and it was just a bleak film about poor, broken people and the abuse they subject themselves and others to.
Wow.
So yeah, there are far more honest films than Trainspotting when it comes to drugs.
Well, let me ask you, Jonathan, you clearly are a fan of Trainspotting, but do you think that the movie stands the test of time?
Yeah. I mean, I watched it last night and I thought it was fantastic. I knew the film, I knew the beats, I knew the cuts, I knew the music cues. There were no surprises, yet I thoroughly enjoyed the ride. I think for me, it just resonates profoundly. These certain movies that just carried the torch for independent filmmaking. Reservoir Dogs did that. Pulp Fiction didn't because it was already, it was Bruce Willis and it was big actors. But it's the breakouts. And although Shallow Grave existed first, most of the world met Danny Boyle and Ewan McGregor for the first time with Trainspotting. And These are the stories. These are the ones that resonate. So I think it is a timeless film.
All right, James, what do you think? Do you think Trainspotting stands the test of time?
Jonathan, I'll give you a perspective from an American point of view. In the 90s, there was this thing where people would say the second British invasion. When you'd cast, Ewan McGregor would be cast in The Phantom Menace, they'd say from Trainspotting. And you have Robert Carlyle, who's going to be in the James Bond film a couple years later as the villain, and he's from Trainspotting. And Kevin McKidd, you got all these guys that are just launched from this movie, and Danny Boyle as well. It was interesting what you said about Sunshine and 28 Days Later, because I agree to an extent that Danny Boyle, sometimes his act 3 is a little bit different than the other parts of his films. I think that for me, I think Sunshine, the first 2/3 of it, might be one of the most beautifully shot, the fantastic sci-fi films ever. The last third, I think it's kind of almost a different film. 28 Days Later, you're right, is a zombie film the first 2/3, and then it's more of like, who are the real monsters? The humans, for the last third. And interesting. But in this film, I think he really nails it. Act 1, 2, and 3. This is the second time I've seen this film, and I have to say I didn't like it the first time I saw it. But watching it now, it's a beautiful film. You're right, it's not Requiem for a Dream, but it's one of those films that rightfully launched the careers of everyone involved, pretty much. I'm almost surprised, though, that Spud, the character that played Spud, Ewan Bremer, I don't know him as well, at least in the United States, but everyone else was launched in this film. And to me, it stands the test of time. What about you, Al? 2 for 2. What do you think? Trainspotting still hold up?
Yes, I definitely think the movie holds up, that it stands the test of time. It's a really well-made movie. I mean, to your point, Jonathan, about, the poor lighting, it does look amateurish because it was made on a shoestring budget, because a lot of these things were done in one take and that was it. They didn't have time to, really set up shots.
They had time.
There's always time for better lighting.
They shot for 6 weeks. It had a style to it. It was cheap. Some of those sets wobbled. If you leaned against the wall, the whole set would have shaken,
Right.
And you know what? I'm totally down with that. It's a minor quibble when it comes to the significance of the movie itself.
Yes, I definitely agree. To me, I read it as a cautionary tale, and I feel like we've kind of gone back and forth on that, and that's subjective, but it feels very realistic to me about how this drug, heroin, can really, really fuck and end lives. And even with the whole thing about it's better than your best orgasm times 1,000, yeah, it still shows you enough of the other side of it where it seems awful, but it feels real. It feels like, yeah, there are people struggling with this addiction. There are people who battle this, and it is that powerful that it can make you look at a dead baby and wail for 30 seconds, but then decide that the thing you need next is another hit. I mean, holy fucking shit. Like that absolutely blows my mind. The acting, the writing, the soundtrack is phenomenal. It stands on its own as an important piece of film. And yeah, of course, I think it stands the test of time.
It's worth adding as well that John Hodge, who wrote the script, he was a doctor before he was a scriptwriter. So
Right.
the film has a very medical, scientific kind of informative style to some of the dialogue and the descriptions.
Right.
When he's talking about the drugs, it's very precise and very specific. It's also worth adding that John Hodge is cameoing in the film as one of the cops chasing Renton at the very beginning of the film, and he's being chased in the streets.
Right. Irvine Welsh has a cameo in it as well, right? He's the one who gives him the suppositories.
Yep. And Irvine Welsh is interesting. I don't know if you've read the books. It's almost written in a dialect of English. They're very hard to read. When you get into them, they work, but they're super hard books to read for me as a Londoner. I'm not familiar with that nuance.
Someone said that yeah, like it is really tough to read it as a book, because with a movie, you can kind of get a little more context. You can put the subtitles on. I watch this movie with subtitles on. Like, it can kind of help. And yeah, there will be some phrases and expressions that'll go over your head. But in a book, you're just kind of more on your own.
Yeah, I think so. I own both Trainspotting and Porno, and I've tried to read both of them, and I'm going to be honest, I failed with both of them.
Okay.
I mean, I brought Trainspotting when the movie came out and couldn't really read it, just couldn't click into it. And then I brought Porno and I took it on holiday. And the front cover of Porno is it's a big red cover, and it's a blow up sex doll with an open mouth. I'm sitting on a beach reading it, and some girl comes up to me and couldn't believe that I wasn't reading actual pornography.
Oh my God.
But she wasn't English. Culturally, she was from a country, a part of the world where everything is very literal. It's like some of those basic commercials. So consequently, she couldn't believe that there was a nuance to any of this, because the nuance was lost on her. I still got her number, obviously, but it's still, I didn't have it on the beach as a conversation starter. It was just, I found it really amusing. I think you can be a lot more adventurous with your marketing in London or in England than you can in certain parts of America, where you're playing to a slightly different crowd.
Sure. But Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. This was such a great conversation.
I loved it.
Thank you to Eddie for setting this up. And Jonathan, please, if there's any other movie you'd like to come on to talk about, please let us know.
Let's do something like that. It'd be fun.
Okay.
Guys, thank you for having me.
Well, this is great.
Yes, thank you. All right, well, that's going to do it for us this week. Come back next week when we will be talking about another movie from the UK, Shaun of the Dead. It's October. It's spooky season. We're going to talk about some scary movies, scary in air quotes. Shaun of the Dead isn't terribly scary, but I'm very excited to revisit that movie. Until then, we want to hear from you guys, the listeners. We are at Test of Time Pod on Facebook, X, Instagram, and Threads. You can email us at testoftimepodcast@gmail.com. And we'll see you next time, everybody.
Bye.